Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Sunny Spot. This is Phil Calderone in for Sunny today. Believe in reality. Today, we have a very interesting topic for you understanding humans, not broad at all. So, I want you to take the opportunity right now to like this video. I can tell you in advance you're going to love it. And subscribe to Skeptic Haven channel, please. And on the other side of the music, I'll see you in a sec. Hello, Greg. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing, Phil?
Nice Pretty good.
Yeah.
I'm going to introduce you to the audience, even though they've probably seen you a couple times before. But for those who haven't, Greg is a biological anthropologist and science communicator with a master's and PhD from Harvard University, trained as an archaeologist and a paleontologist with a specialty in the interaction between humans and the environment. So since we're going to talk about humans, and I suspect that the environment is going to come up as a piece of that, that will come in very handy.
Yeah.
So understanding humans, I mean, it's almost hard to know where to begin, because do we talk about behavior? Do we talk about but the biology? I am tempted to start at sort of a breakdown beginning, which is to say that humans came from previous animals, right? So let's start with you just defining what is a human. Let's start right there.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that we could probably spend the entire show on that one question, I suppose, because it's like I'm reminded of the question of what is a bird. Despite the recent movement that birds aren't real, which I think is a lot of really fun. Have you heard about that?
Birds aren't real. Blast. Please, everybody, Google birds aren't real.
Yeah, it's great.
It is so great.
Because they're totally not real, it turns out. Anyway, people, when I first heard the phrase birds aren't real, I thought it was a reference to the fact that birds are dinosaurs. It isn't. It's a reference to them not existing at all. But anyway.
In the United States.
Yeah, right, I guess. Yeah. And the thing is, I have problems with the statement that birds are dinosaurs, because they're not. But what people who are into paleontology often insist that they are. But dolphins are not cattle. Yet the nearest common ancestor of a dolphin and a cattle is more like a cattle than a dolphin. Okay.
Yeah.
But technically, dolphins are cattle, but they're not. The fact that the dinosaurs are extinct seems to give them a special role as ancient, but if they weren't extinct, they wouldn't be ancient, and they'd just be dinosaurs, living dinosaurs, and it wouldn't do us any good to confuse or conflate birds and dinosaurs as being the same thing, because if you made that mistake, well, unless some of the terror birds are still alive, it's a matter of life and death decision as to whether or not it's a bird or a dinosaur or some other. You get a lot of things wrong. The thing is,
and just try to crossbreed a chicken with a T-Rex,
right? And what's even more interesting, and this is why birds are dinosaurs, is that if you look at all the features that make a bird, what are they? Well, one of them is that they can fly. That's one feature. Okay. Another feature is that they breathe kind of in a unidirectional manner through their lungs. They have they push the air through their lungs in a very different way, and they use pneumaticized bone in their breathing. Another is that they have some other things about their metabolic rate and their heart rate that are different. Their poikilothermy, the way that they do thermal regulation. There's a bunch of features that they have that make them extremely good at aerobic activity, which is flying. So other things,
high energy activity. Yeah.
So presumably, it would seem that all those adaptations are because they fly, but all those adaptations that they have other than flying are found in the dinosaurs that they're related to, which didn't fly. So all the list of things that make a bird actually includes mostly things that apply to a certain category of dinosaur, as well as birds. So it doesn't distinguish birds as different. The flight part does. Okay. So it's probably true of the humans. There's a bunch of things we think of as humans as special to humans, but they probably were true in other species that were not humans, that are all extinct now. And some of them might even be found in some organisms like chimpanzees that are related, that aren't extinct by chance. They're not extinct.
Mhm.
Imagine how we would be formulating all these questions if chimps and gorillas had all gone extinct at some point, like 500,000 years ago. They would also be among our extinct, quote unquote, ancestors. But the fact that they're not extinct makes them clearly not ancestors. You know, so
right. And but we've also had. I'm presuming that there have been simian species that are extinct, just like
absolutely.
there's a human branch. There have to have been I don't know. I'm using simian as sort of a broad.
Yeah.
Not all of them went extinct, and not only the ones that came to exist in present day existed, way back when, of course.
We know that there are parts of Africa that absolutely had populations of gorillas that are gone. We know that there are parts of Asia that had populations of orangutans that are gone. So they might have been distinct species, like now there's multiple species or varieties. Anyway, so what features, so of humans, what makes humans human is going to be a bunch of features that we won't find in any other animal, but they would have been in those that went extinct, like Australopithecines, maybe. Some features are in a form in other animals. Like there are things that chimpanzees have as a feature that we share with them, but we are otherwise so different that we don't see it as the same feature, maybe. And then there's a special feature that's only found in humans and arose when our species became a species. And in between those last two, there are features that only existed in our immediate actual ancestral species. So
let's put a time to that. Our immediate ancestral species, 250,000 years before that. Where would you place that time period?
Now that we're sliding through time, it gets really hard to draw lines, right? So the immediate ancestral, the immediate ancestral species, the thing that if you saw it, you would probably call it a different species, would be somewhere in. If I wanted to find one, I'd go back in time to about 250,000 years ago, and back in time to about 1 million years ago, and I'd look for 2 or 3 points in time during that period. So 1 million years ago, more than 1 million years ago, Homo erectus emerges. Homo erectus exists 1 million years ago. Modern humans don't. Modern humans do exist 250,000 years ago. So I'd look at something that was 650,000 years ago, and that was my direct ancestor and your direct ancestor, and say that is probably not Homo sapiens sapiens. It's probably not Homo erectus. And actually, we are confused about what we want to call that organism. But whatever that is, that's our previous species. And I wouldn't say that it would be necessary. Do the features that make us unique humans, were they in that animal or not, is something that I tend to think that most of them were, but they would be different. Other people say definitely not. And that's a debate.
What comes to mind here is in terms of behavior, I want to go back even further, because when I think of how the brain is structured, we've got middle brain elements and behaviors that come way before that. So that the amygdala and things like that. So to get that kind of background, how far? What are we looking at? How far back to to get a mammal that has our first bit of let's say emotional basis, emotional commonality?
That's a good question. We know so little about mammals before the crown species of the living mammals today, and even that's conjectural. So there were, and I recently heard someone say, "Don't call the mammal-like reptiles mammal-like reptiles. They were just early mammals, but so different from later mammals that you have to just accept that they're just really different." This would be back 100 million years ago. Was there anything in the limbic system of these mammal-like reptiles, or whatever you want to call them? Was there anything in their neurobiology that you would say was a mammalian sort of thing? So we know, for example, that modern mammals. Okay, I'm about to say something questionable, because we have not sampled more than how many mammals have we actually dissected their brains and studied their behavior intensely? Dozens, but there's thousands. So, but modern mammals have a limbic system that you referred to that has emotional capacities that are roughly translatable across species. Many of them are, not completely, but while any given species might have a kind of a unique set of emotional systems, they all have 4 or 5 emotions the same. Now, they might act differently in different animals. They might be used in different ways, but they're all there. Okay.
What would those be? I mean, fear comes to mind, but what?
Yeah, the 4
said
Fs.
4.
The 4 Fs. The
Which are?
fleeting, feeding, fighting, and sex are the 4 Fs.
Yeah.
And some other ones that are probably in there that might be more nuanced. Okay. So they're going to be across mammals. Now, when I say across mammals, maybe monotremes don't have them. I don't know. I'm not sure about the marsupial placental difference, but let's say at least across all placental mammals and probably marsupials too, that they're there. But are those features that emerged before the KT extinction in the early pre-mammal mammals or later? I don't know. That's something that I think is really offhand.
The KT extinction. Can you define that?
65 million years ago when the dinosaurs went extinct.
The dinosaurs. Okay.
There were pre-mammals around before that. Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't know, not because it's unknown. I just don't know what their brain endocrania look like. I don't know what the endocrania. I've held the fossils in my hands of some of these early mammal-like reptiles, and I've looked at them, but their skulls were complete, and I couldn't see inside. And I don't know what they look like. So that's someone else can conjecture on that. But all of the mammals that are the common ancestors of living rodents and living primates and living bats and all those kind of creatures and living carnivores and living ungulates, their ancestral form, most recent, did have the limbic system parts probably that look kind of like ours. So that doesn't narrow down what makes a human so much, because we don't know, like those aren't. So I would say that.
Well, that gives us a foundation, I would think.
Yeah.
I mean, when you take us to the most base behavior, so we've got that. So if we now start to grow the not the frontal lobe, but the brain, the size of the cortex, I guess, right?
Yeah.
What comes along next? Let's just say before Lucy. So we're talking about maybe 8 million years, somewhere around that zone.
Yeah, or even before that. The earliest primates, going back to 50 million years or so, had an expanded cortex, and it was expanded especially in the occipital regions and the temporal regions. And there's various hypotheses about this, but they had a lot of there was a lot of structure in their brains related to sight, and so they were very visual. And there may have been other mammals that were as well, but it's like, I always think it's funny when people say, "Oh, the rhinoceros has really lousy vision. The cows have really lousy vision." No, they don't. They have average mammal vision. We have a spectacularly good vision for a mammal. We are almost as good with our eyes as birds are, to the extent that they exist. Birds have amazing vision, but we have super amazing vision. For an animal that comes from nocturnal backgrounds, we have really good vision. And we also have limbs that are extremely primitive. So they haven't been derived and adapted to very highly specialized uses for the most cases, which has allowed them to be micro-adapted to spectacular results. So our ancestors were able to fly themselves through trees by leaping, and use hand-eye coordination to do it. That was pretty spectacular, and that all set up this large occipital brain. And people talk about the frontal cortex as being really important in cognition. So is the occipital region. If you have a memory and you have some language areas are in the occipital region, and it's a pretty important region, and that being expanded was probably very important.
That's at the back?
At the back,
okay.
Yeah. The other thing that we have in our history, and this can be misunderstood a little bit, but a lot of primates are not that social. We tend to think of sociality as being important in primates, but I just want to note that if you add up all the species of primates, the majority are solitary or monogamous. Okay. But because the prosimians tend to be solitary, New World primates tend to be not polygynous, and the gibbons, most apes are monogamous because most apes are gibbons or siamangs.
Right.
And when we talk about behavior, we go right to polygyny. It's like I've done a lot of teaching of first-year college students, or basically high school students. And when you start talking about sexual systems and mating systems, you get to polygyny, everyone gets excited about polygyny. So,
Yeah.
and I think that's generally a very, very common thing. About polygyny is not universal in primate backgrounds, and neither is sociality that completely universal. But the monkeys and nearly closely related apes of the old world, by and large, are highly social and highly social. So sociality, that's a really, really important trait that has to have a brain that can do that. And the brain, just like a brain that can do hand-eye coordination and all that stuff the early primates did, we think about the brain as being specially adapted in that manner. Sociality also requires a brain to be adapted spectacularly. Major adaptations of the brain have to happen to have sociality.
So sociology
So
would
sociality,
be
yeah.
basically having the ability to keep, well, not only knowledge of current and past time and future time, or like anticipating what things might do, but having knowledge of what another person in this case would possibly do. So that's when you start to get gossip becoming a big important thing, right? Because you're trying to predict other beings' behaviors.
Yeah, and so this is Dunbar's hypothesis, is that controlling for certain other factors, larger groups require larger brains. Like if your average group of the
Mm.
species of monkey or whatever requires if the group size is bigger than some other group, that group with a bigger group size will tend to have a larger brain. The spectacular shit. Now, let's go to chimpanzees for a minute. Chimpanzees have a lot of complexity. They live a long time, and they have and they have relatively long generations, and they have a lot of complexity that is critical to their survival. But all of their like the stuff you just talked about, the sociality that requires a sense of your place in the community and what
Yeah.
other individuals are going to do, etc. That stuff, thinking of that as sticking that on chimpanzees, it applies mainly, as far as we know, to the group you live in, to the community that you live in. And you know about communities outside, but there's not a lot of politics. There's not a lot of nuanced politics outside of your group. It's all within your group. And the outside group is very important. And the outside group actually drives what happens on the inside groups, because they're competing and killing each other and stuff like that. Whereas in humans, what happens outside of our group and other groups can be more important and is very much integrated with our behavior. We are arranging matings and marriages with other groups. We're arranging to not fight with other groups. We're arranging trade, and I'm talking about very, very basic societies. We're arranging trade and exchange of things and people and agreements about the use of space and resources. We're doing a lot of stuff that a lot of people imagine hunter-gatherers sitting around the campfire exchanging information about hunting and gathering and all that stuff. I sat around that campfire with hunter-gatherers for 3 years. That never happened. Okay. But the conversations are about everybody in other groups. Not always, but often.
Mm.
It's the extension of the complex interactive politics among group members to everybody else with equal strength or greater strength that humans have that chimpanzees don't have.
That's interesting. That's a big jump from like an us versus them, right? Us is within our group, and we can keep knowledge of so many of them according to the complexity of our brain. But just to have the thought that that there are that other groups are going to behave in a different way, other than they're always going to try to kill us.
Right.
Going into that, the altruistic or reciprocal altruism, I guess, right? You trade with me, I trade with you, kind of a thing, is a whole nother level of complexity.
Yes, absolutely. And we find that across human societies. So it's a trait of ours. Yeah.
Say, what do we know, or maybe there's just hypotheses, but say something about, or talk a little bit about the difference between which came first, when you've got the growth of the brain and the development of a behavior.
Okay, that's a good question, and that's a difficult question. You can't have selection on the physical development of an organ to serve a behavior without the behavior existing, right? But you can't
Yeah.
have the behavior without the organ being there to produce the behavior in a sense. So, right. So that's why that's a good question. Like, who the heck knows?
Yeah.
One thing that this gets to a whole other kind of way of thinking about this. I think that elements in evolution, which might which would involve behaviors, can change and evolve. Think about, there's two things you got to think about. One is what I call an atomistic system, where you take a system and you break it into the parts that make it up. And if you conceptualize those parts as being distinct, you might be able to conceptualize them as being transferable. So there might be a behavior that is genetically determined, and another behavior that looks the same but is learned. Okay. Now, I'm not saying this works with any human. I'm not saying this works with any human. I'm just saying, in theory, in behaving animals, you might have a behavior that is genetically determined, but it's refined, say, in life, like how you do it, you learn better. So the learning context in the society is critically important. And as long as that's there, it becomes like vitamin C in our physiology. The vitamin C role that we don't have, that prevents scurvy, okay? Most mammals can produce their vitamin C in that role, and primates can't because they eat fruit all the time. So they have a behavioral way of getting vitamin C, which is eating fruit. So the genetic production of vitamin C in their cells mutated away just sort of by accident. So something that was purely genetic becomes purely behavioral. Okay. Now think about the process of, there's a bunch of prey animals like deer and antelopes, and a bunch of predator animals like wolves. Okay. And people are in this environment. Some early human societies, fully human, are in this environment too. Okay. If you look at what the wolves do and what their prey do, there's many little tiny parts that make up a wolf behavior, many little tiny parts that make up the prey behavior. Okay. Just take them all, put them on little Post-its and put them aside. And now map out the behavior of a shepherd, the sheepdogs that herd sheep, the protector dogs, which protect the herds. They're two different kinds of dogs. And the sheep themselves, map out that behavior with the shepherd in there as well. And now go get your Post-its from when there were only wolves and wild prey animals. Those Post-its can all be stuck on those behaviors. Okay. Like a very simple example, a herding dog, a collie, will do a thing where it puts its paws in front of its face and hunkers down and stares. That makes a sheep do a certain thing. Makes a sheep go find another sheep and stand next to it. Okay. That is a behavior that wolves do when they're about to attack a sheep. And the wolf and the prey animals herd up. Okay. So everything that a sheepdog does is something as a piece of what a wolf does. And everything that the sheep do is a piece of what a wild proto sheep does. And the humans have put themselves in there to kind of control it and become part wolf because we eat these animals, part protector that we herd them. So the same exact behaviors are all redistributed. Some of those behaviors in the first round prior to human shepherds were learned. Wolves learn how to act, and some of them are pretty much genetically determined. They also have genetically determined behaviors. Same with the wild animals are mostly genetic. The wolves are a mixture. Okay. And so there are probably behaviors that are done all the behaviors that the humans use, they're all learned in this system because humans were not wolves and humans were not wild sheep. So everything we do that replaces those behaviors is learned, and it might be replacing a genetic behavior. So I think that a genetically determined behavior can become non-genetically determined. And a learned behavior probably can become genetic. Okay.
Yeah.
So so it's not a chicken and egg. It's now a bunch of different things that are chicken-like and a bunch of things that are egg-like that can trade features with each other.
So it's a real web there.
Yes,
I mean,
the web is good.
You know, and interactive, pretty much by definition. I mean, like you say, nothing exists by itself, right? I mean, environment is a big word, right? Because it's everything from what you're being taught to what's around you, to temperatures, to everything that is interacting with you, the temperatures, the animals,
Right.
the seasonal changes, pretty much everything.
Yeah, about 12 years ago, there's a conference that happens, I think, every 2 years called the Evolution Conference or Evolution. It happens, the rule is it must happen in a different country every year. It can't happen in the same country within like a 5-year period. So it's like this super international conference. And about 12 years ago, it happened here in Minneapolis. So I
Oh,
I
wow.
helped organize it in the sense that we were getting teachers involved. We were bringing teachers in to interact with the evolutionary people. But these keynote, I don't remember who gave the keynote address. It was a famous evolutionary biologist. I don't remember who it was now. He got up and said, we used to talk about coevolution as something that might be true. Then we started
Hmm.
talking about coevolution like it's kind of important in some cases. Then we started talking about it like, wow, it's really important in some cases. Now we understand that when we say the word evolution, we mean coevolution without exception in every case.
Yeah, that makes
Everything,
sense.
everything is
Yeah.
coevolution now. So it's just that's where people study coevolution. So we just drop the co off and stick in that. Yeah.
What do you think about variations within a group at any species level that allow for propensities to have different styles of behavior, leading to an impact that might start to select at some point?
So group level behaviors that are selected.
Yeah, I mean, it's just take something real basic, even like fear,
Mhm.
where I would think that there would be some individuals within a population that are more fearful and some are less
Mhm.
fearful,
Right.
just related to brain chemistry. And somehow that might be selected upon by the environment and the situation that they're in.
Yeah. So in a sense, you're almost describing maybe a more manageable example could be something like creativity.
Mm,
Individuals who are maybe are more creative in a certain area than other people, or have some propensity to explore something, might have a huge impact on cultural evolution. They're literally inventing things, or
yeah,
and a society that treats people who are different as something bad versus something good. If the constraints in a society that a society poses on itself are either very rigorous or very loose, that would control, that would have a big impact on how much the kind of variation you're
yeah.
talking about mattered, or how much it impacted things.
I'm thinking of even before that though, because for sure culture is going to influence and select in its own way, and kind of at a faster level than evolution, I would think. But I'm wondering how much of this type of thing might affect us early on. I mean, why are we, let's just say, more aggressive, less aggressive, or why
Mhm.
is one species more aggressive, less aggressive, that kind of a
Yeah,
thing?
I have an example that might pertain here. Um, I don't remember the name of the individual, but in Jane Goodall's one of Jane Goodall's main chimp focus groups at Gombe, um, there was a female. In theory, a female chimpanzee is normally reaches sexual maturity and leaves the group. In many primates, the male is forced out of the group, like in baboons. But
Hmm.
as in the case of sort of lions, I think lion experts might use the word escorted. The male lion, when they reach a certain age, is escorted out of the group by the other males and the females, because they don't want this male around to cause paternity stress, which causes infanticide. Okay, so
Yeah.
the females are escorted out, as it were, the chimpanzee group. But there was this one female. Oh, it was Flo. I'm pretty sure it was Flo, the very famous chimpanzee Flo. We've probably heard of her.
I've
Um,
heard the name, but I don't know
yeah,
her more than
uh,
that. So,
she reached sexual maturity and didn't leave. And then I think, if I got this correctly, she had 3 or 4 offspring that were females, and they didn't leave either.
hmm,
I'm getting this slightly wrong, so like look it up and get the correct story. But she created a subset of her group that was matrilineal, when chimps are really patrilineal.
That's
Now,
interesting. Yeah.
that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Not only that, but Flo becomes the chimpanzee that gets talked about a lot, to the extent that when she died, her death was extremely closely monitored and filmed. I don't think she wasn't filmed dying. She was filmed getting old, and then she was found in a stream, dead, one morning. And it was very interesting because I heard, I probably shouldn't talk out of turn. I don't think I'm supposed to repeat the story, but by now it's too late. It was 30 years ago. There was a fight. I don't remember who said what. It was between Jane Goodall and others, saying, do we leave her body there and document it round the clock? Because they had just found Lucy, or they just found Narukatomi, I think it was, which is the Homo erectus skeleton that died in the stream and slowly deteriorated. And his feet,
wow.
his feet bones went away, but everything else stayed the same. So she's there in the same setting, more or less. So let's just film this and watch it, the taphonomy of this process, because this will be really. So now one could say, well, it's a good idea to do that if you've got a typical chimpanzee, but we've got Flo.
Yeah.
Now, maybe she's not typical. Maybe she's bigger and
Yeah.
stronger and has different muscles than other chimpanzees. Who knows? But I don't remember what they did either. I'm pretty sure that they took her and buried her with a monument or something because she was a famous chimpanzee. But yeah, that's a good example, I think, where there's a behavior that we would say that the locality system, natural locality versus patril locality, that's what it's called in human societies. But whether it's female bonded or male bonded, that's the difference. That's what we call it in primates. That's a critically important part to reciprocal altruism, to actual kin-based altruism, to everything in the society. It's critically important. It's fundamental to any primate society. Okay. Also, many different primates have different systems, so they evolved to be different. Well, maybe with Flo, we're seeing it happen. She created a matrilineal version of a matrilocal version of a chimpanzee society.
It's an interesting demonstration too, I think, of the variation in the evolutionary process too, right? Because you can have that's a big jump essentially, right? Because she had a behavior that was very different, and as opposed to a behavior that can just develop slowly over time.
Yeah, I'm seeing a question. I'm seeing a question by a listener, Titan.
Yeah.
Is there an implication that the matrilineal behavior may be a genetic component? Good question. And first of all, my belief is if you want to say that there's a genetic component to behavior, we need to see the gene. And there isn't one, because no behavior is controlled by a single gene almost ever. Now, then you can go and say, yeah, but there's a bunch of genes and they kind of correlate. Okay, so the same exact people with a skeptical attitude will say correlation does not imply causation, will often uncritically accept there's a lot of genes and they seem to correlate. Okay, there is a genetic component to absolutely every single thing, because we are organized as genetically determined physical organisms. So the fact that we have one head, I never say your full name. That's right, Titan Uranus. Because we have one head, our society only wear one hat at a time. Yeah. So the fact that we wear only one head at a time is genetically determined, but it has zero heritability, because numbers of heads has zero heritability because it doesn't vary. Okay, so yes, of course, locality is genetically determined in a sense, because it is a function of the behavioral, the stuff you're talking about, Phil, this interaction of the physical animal and its behavior and its environment leads to one sex leaving being a better idea. And then when sexual maturity happens and how it happens and what it looks like determines it. So that's all pretty genetically determined, probably. So, but the idea of one sex leaving versus the other, that itself is emergent, but it's emergent from a lot of other things that are mostly genetically determined. So it's going to happen no matter what the genes do, as long as you have large males and small females, and which comes from polygyny, what we call polygyny, et cetera, you're going to end up with males leaving, for example, in an open country primate that eats certain things. And
And
Yeah.
just because it happens also doesn't mean it was going to happen, which
Yeah.
is interesting.
Yes,
You
exactly.
know, so
Yeah.
that's sort of the random part of the process. So let's jump to humans now. Let's
Mhm.
jump forward. What can we do that uh well, I don't want to say gorillas because maybe that's a little too close, but what's the highest? The closest to us is
Well,
gorillas and
chimpanzees are our closest relatives.
chimpanzees and orangutans, or is that
They're way orangutans.
that's a different branch?
That's a way earlier split among the apes.
Okay.
So it goes orangutan splitting off first, and then gorillas and chimpanzees. Um, gorillas split off first, and then chimpanzees are a sister species,
So what can we do that gorillas can't do?
or that chimpanzees can't do.
Sorry, chimpanzees. Yeah.
Um, okay, here's what's interesting. Nothing is a valid answer if we step back and look at it coarsely enough, and allow one rule to be broken, which is we're going to test the chimpanzees to see if they can do it, but we're going to look at chimpanzees that are raised in a human society.
Hmm.
Okay, human beings can get a set of tools and take apart a car. The chimpanzees that were these stars on the TV show Lancelot Link, Secret Chimp, which is a Saturday morning TV show for kids, they could take apart cars because they drove cars. I mean, these chimpanzees were trained
Oh,
to
wow.
drive little chimp cars around to make scenes in which they drive. And there were mechanics playing around with these cars, and the chimpanzees just went, we can do that too. Now, they couldn't fix them or assemble them, but they could take them apart. Okay, they could use a wrench. Okay?
They could repeat, yeah, using the
Right.
tools and stuff.
Right. And there's a great example of my two favorite examples are actually with orangutans. One of them it was a research site in Borneo where there was a dock. Everything in Borneo is water everywhere, right? So there's a dock that went out over this river. And on the dock was a place where people would put their dirty clothes. And next to it was a place where a woman who worked there would wash the clothes and then rinse them and run them through a roller, right? An old-fashioned roller, and then hang them with clothespins. One day, she only worked like 5 days a week. On a Saturday morning or something, there were dirty clothes in there, and there was a female orangutan. This is a place where they would take orangutans that had been captured by humans as babies and raised, and then they would hand them over to the rehab place. So these are orangutans that lived in the vicinity of the humans in the forest, but they were with the humans all the time. Okay, and this female orang, I think it was, went over to the clothes cleaning area, took out the clothes, and followed the entire procedure and did the laundry that day.
Wow.
Another occasion, they used for cooking, they used this thing that I think we know is in the U.S. is a Savea stove, SVE, Savea, and it's a stove that I think it has alcohol in it. It has some burnable substance in it, and you use a second liquid burnable substance you put on the top of it, light it on fire, so the mechanism heats up, and then you slowly turn on now the pressurized liquid, and it comes out a little gas, and then blows up in your face sometimes, but normally then you get a nice flame to cook your food on. They had a big one of those. This is a really hard stove to light, technically very difficult to start. So there's a person who knows how to do it, and there's a male orang sitting around watching everybody. And one day the male orang went over and knew how to use a lighter, knew how to use a stove, and actually got the stove to work by himself. That's something you couldn't do and I couldn't do.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to do. And they have these big gangly hands. So that happened. Okay. So we all know about Kanzi, the bonobo chimp, that was really, really good at language. It's a big fight over whether Kanzi really had a sophisticated language or only a sort of language. Okay.
Or even Coco too. There's debate about that.
Coco the gorilla. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Coco is pretty sophisticated for a gorilla. So Kanzi, they did not teach Kanzi sign language. They taught Kanzi's mother sign language. Kanzi was a baby in mother's arms. Kanzi's mother was too old to learn a language, to become linguistic. It isn't just learning a language. It isn't like, can chimps learn language? No. Can you learn a language? No. Can I learn language? No. Can we become linguistic? Yes. If you live in a linguistic environment, our brains, your brain, my brain, can become a linguistic brain. In the absence of a
Wait,
linguistic environment, you can't.
Define that a little bit more. I don't understand the difference
the-
between becoming linguistic and being able to use a language.
That's no difference there. I said learning a language versus becoming linguistic. So you have to become a linguistic individual. You have to have a mind, a brain that is wired up to process information linguistically. That goes way beyond language. We process all kinds of stuff linguistically without anybody talking to anybody. Okay.
Is that like an ordering type process, like grammar and?
That's part of it. There's all the different features of language you can think of are part of that whole linguistic process. So the main thing about it is that we are taking meaning and conveying it and understanding it using symbolic systems rather than direct reference or iconic or something like that. Okay. So it's a human being learns that as they're growing up in the early years of their life, if they're in a linguistic environment, if they're with other humans that are doing this.
Oh, okay.
If you're a wild child, and there haven't been very many cases, you don't get that. Jeannie, aka Nell, in the movie played by with Jodie Foster, didn't really become fully linguistic as an adult. It was too late.
Oh wow.
She basically was as good as Kanzi.
Oh wow.
Okay, Kanzi might have been better in a sense. So Kanzi's mother didn't become linguistic when they tried to teach her language, any more than any other ape has ever really done. But the baby Kanzi did become somewhat linguistic, and then became really good at sign language, and not only good at sign language, but good at doing, conceptualizing things. So there's a little bit of film I saw with Kanzi's keeper, Rumba, I think was her name, in her kitchen, and she says, "Hey, let's have Italian tonight." What does that mean? What is the word? Let's have Italian. What the heck does that mean? Well, obviously, it's where you go put a pot under the faucet, get water in it, put it on the stove. You go find the spaghetti, and you wait for the pot to boil, and that's what the chimpanzee did. In reference to that statement, okay, that's totally linguistic. Okay, and words that have no internal innate meaning, that were not that specific, led to a complete complex behavior, and it's pretty rote cooking Italian food, but that's pretty good. So I think that when it comes to the categorically, like check boxes of what you can do, what you can't do, chimpanzees can probably do an awful lot of things that are on the human list, but in the wild, they don't do those things.
Interesting.
Okay, so we can create a semi-human by raising an ape in a completely human environment, and we're still not getting a complete human, but we're going to get something surprisingly impressively close.
This also demonstrates how difficult it is to put a line between species sometimes, especially as you look back over a long time, and you compare us to humans 100,000 years ago compared to 250,000 years ago and beyond. I mean,
and the evolutionary,
it's a lot of gray.
The evolutionary time between a living chimpanzee and a living human is way over 10 million years. Okay, go all the way back and all the way back up again. And to be honest with you, I don't know what we're currently thinking about the chimp-human split, because for a while there was 5 million, then it went to 7 or 8 million, then it went back up to about 6.5 million. And then people figured out actually there was probably a split that was with a lot of transference back and forth of DNA for a couple million years. And I don't know if that's currently what we're thinking, but it's at least 5 million years completely split. So that's 10 million years in both directions. And it's probably more like 15 million years in both directions. Whereas going back a couple 100,000 years in our lineage is only going one direction.
Yeah.
So I think that if you took an ancestor, like go back in a time machine, and every 50,000 years get a few human babies and bring them here to this time and put them in families. Go every 50,000 years for the last 500,000 years. At what point do the babies when they grow up somehow not count as humans somehow? At what point are they not completely distinguishable from everybody else?
Yeah.
They might look a little funny. And I would say that you wouldn't find it for 500,000 years. You might not find it that far back. You might have to go back 1 million years to get that, 700,000 years to get that.
That would be so cool. If we ever invent time machines, we need to be able to do. That's got to be like one of these priorities.
Yeah, right.
There's so much of what we learn is it's like implied, right? And and you're working with tiny pieces of information.
Yeah.
Like you say, we don't have brains. We have brain cases, for example.
Right.
All right. So all the way up to modern day, and maybe this gets out of your specialty, but I'm going to try it anyways. So understanding humans, how much differentiation do you think we have on understanding, say, one human versus another? The variety of human brains and behaviors. Well, you might have to speculate on this.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I know that from experimental work, that's natural experiments that have happened, that there's no innate difference between humans across our species. We have many, many, many examples of individuals, either a baby literally being taken out of its environment and raised somewhere else. We have that cross raising experiment between Australian Aboriginal children and British households, between Latin American children who are native descendants of natives and Europeans who've come to North America. We've had that. We've had all of the experiments, thanks mostly to missionaries and wars. We have a lot of that going on, and as long as the children were not abused or messed up by the war, they are raised in their new society exactly like they were born there of those parents, and later often run into problems if they have a racial feature that people bully them over. But other than that problem, which we create, we have so many cross population examples that we can say for sure that all the behavioral things that make you human, everything from intelligence to proclivities and everything else, is not genetic at all. Okay. Now, then we have the twins studies, and that shows us at face value, and I will criticize this in a moment, at face value, two people separated at birth and raised separately will do things like they'll have the same car when they're 50. They'll prefer yellow. They'll go to the same kind of school, like they'll go to a Catholic school or they go to a public school, or they'll go into the same job. And a lot of little quirky things. So like the woman or man that they marry will be like the same, like the same color hair, the same, that kind of stuff, right? Now, there's a reason why that is bullshit, is for two reasons. First, if you are separated at birth, but you're still living in Cincinnati, then many of the things that we find similar are going to be applied to you because you live in Cincinnati. Baby is separated at birth, and one is then raised by Kikuyu tribesmen in Kenya, and the other is raised by Inuit in Alaska. That experiment, if that happened, we wouldn't know who they were. Okay. We can't find those twins. You can only find the twins that are still in the same culture, still being tracked in the same system, right? Number one. So right there, you got to be suspicious of it that way. The other thing is, my brother and I are not twins, but if we were, we would be counted as separate at birth and raised separately. Do you know why? Because we lived in one house, and when I lived in his bedroom, when I was born, my crib went into his bedroom. So for like 1 year, 1.5 years, we were living in the same bedroom. Then my grandfather died. He lived upstairs. It was a 2-family house. Not 2 families living in one house. I mean, 2-family house, like 2 units. My grandmother and grandfather lived upstairs. But we all ate together. We all did everything together, right? It was as though we were living in a single house, but it was a 2-family house. My grandfather died. My brother took over a bedroom upstairs and moved upstairs. That would qualify us as separated, according to the criteria used in the twin study. People living in the same building, but separate. So a divorce, one parent takes one kid, the other parent takes another kid. More often, it's one kid going with a grandparent, the other going with a cousin. Okay?
Yeah.
They know each other while they're growing up. They're living in the same family, often the same building, always the same neighborhood. They are not separated. So that study was made up.
Is that ongoing? I mean, I know there was that famous group that you're talking about.
Yeah.
That's taken criticism.
And they've done. I don't know what they're doing now. They've done some good research and stuff. It wasn't all bogus, but the separated at birth part was bogus. Okay. There's actually, have you seen that documentary? I wish I could cite it precisely. But there's these three brothers who found out that they were all related to each other.
Mm-mm.
And then, so the first half of the documentary, they're like, they're identical, yet they never knew each other. They were separated. They were truly separated as babies. They separated as babies and had very different lives, but they were identical in so many ways in the first half of the documentary. And the second half of the documentary is like, wait a minute. Those similarities, some of them were just made up so they could go on TV. and then there were all these great differences, and it turned out being really, really different. And they ended up hating the scientists because the scientists have put them through this whole life of being whatever. So we do not get genetic coding that makes us the same when we've been separated. It's our cultural coding that's more important. So this
is why you don't put a lot of weight into single studies too.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, even Now the other thing though is I'd like to just mention is I wonder about, and this has been Sex at Dawn, the book which talks about this stuff. If you go to the ethnographic record, I spent a lot of time with the ethnographic record. Some of my research is with living people. A fair amount of my research is with living actual people. Okay, and when we identify a group of people, a culture, we often in our research shave it down and narrow it down to a nominal version of it that doesn't express a variation that happened there, and we often end up not seeing the variation that's possible because we were not the first people. We anthropologists were not the first people there. Missionaries were the first people there. Government agents were the first people here. Stuff a culture does was made illegal before we arrived. So then it's a matter of peeling back that and saying, okay, before it was illegal, what did you do about this and that? And we can find stuff out. Then what happens is the stories we hear become increasingly unbelievable. So at what point is the story strange but true?
Yeah.
Versus someone's making something up and they're telling you stories from their ancestry, not their own life. They're talking about something their grandparents said that they heard from somebody. So I think that colonialism and missionary activity and that kind of stuff has trimmed down a lot of variation across cultures. And to reconstruct the actual variation requires telling the difference between something that's unbelievable but true and something that's just not true in a way that you really can't tell. So I suspect humans have more variation in our cultural behavior than we know about.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a tough thing. Culture is such a strong influencer,
Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions here, and I want to throw these up. So let's pull one up here from, is that Cafel? What about Terence McKenna's stoned ape hypothesis? Has this been discussed on the stream?
I don't. Do you know what that is?
I don't.
Okay. I don't either, but it sounds like, because it's a stoned ape, it sounds like it might be related to use of hallucinogenic drugs or something like that. And I know that I don't know. I don't want to say anything about McKenna's hypothesis because I don't know what it is. It might be a great idea, but the idea of people discovering and human ancestors discovering meaningful, like actual chemically meaningful substances that you can consume and change your mind, your brain, has often come up as an idea of what things that have happened in the past. I think that when I studied the FA pygmies, I was 5 years into a study that other people had done. So I was like year 6, 7, 8, 9, and no one had reported anything about any hallucinogenic drug use by the pygmies at all. However, what I did was different from other people, and that is I stayed with them and lived with them like all the time for many, many months, and no researchers had really done that before in that study. So I saw things other people didn't see now and then, and one of them was the use of things that made them hallucinate. It certainly wasn't common. They weren't hallucinating that much, but it was very much a part of what they were doing and something they were keeping secret, but they happened to let me know about. So I think that when we look at cultures, I think that's often something that happens. We're not supposed to see these things. And especially when you've had missionaries go through and like making everything illegal. So what society is there that doesn't have a hallucinogenic drug?
Well, I got it Googled real quick here. They're referring to the human brain doubled in size and power. Sorry, power very suddenly 200,000 years ago. So it's being proposed psychedelic mushrooms as a trigger for rapid cognitive evolution.
Okay, there's nothing in
So
there. There's nothing in the archaeological record that has the human brain doubling in anything 200,000 years ago. What
okay,
happened was a 500,000 years ago, we see a sudden, nuanced but important change in stone tool technology. That then, over the next 250,000 years, evolves steadily into a really significant change in technology. And at the beginning of that time and at the end of the time, human brains are the same size the whole time. But other cultural traits start to come in. So the very first use of what might be medicine, this case is not well documented, it is not proven. But I believe Peter Beaumont of South Africa, when he suggests that there was evidence of geophagy in these certain rocks that really looks like about 500,000 to 300,000 years old.
what is that? Geo what?
In this case, they were making, okay, in later times you can find where people are grinding stone in these little spots on rock to turn it into powder and then eating it. And those grinding spots become little cupules that form. And there are some of those that look like they have to be about 500,000 to 300,000 years ago based on the varnish that's on them. That the rock
You're
forms
talking
of
about
varnish.
for grinding areas for like grinding grains and
No,
and
little tiny
seeds and
things, little tiny things this big. So it's only going to be for little tiny substances. And where we find
Huh.
it in the ethnographic record is always for some kind of drug.
Hmm.
By drug, I mean a medicine.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a hallucinating drug, but it's usually something to help your stomach or to get rid of some kind of parasite. So the idea of preparing something to consume to make you different, in this case, maybe it's like more or less taking a Rolaids or a Tums, but still, it's a medicine. That may
Yeah.
go back to the beginning of this period when these stone tools changes happen. Okay, so the possibility of taking things from the environment and eating them for something other than food, I think, is totally on the table. Chimpanzees do weird things. They take
Yeah.
things that are probably changing their behavior a little bit that make them stoned. They take leaves and wrap them around pieces of meat to make little hors d'oeuvres and eat them. I mean, the chimpanzees are quite capable of discovering and taking in some kind of drug, plant matter. They eat so many plants. I mean, there's some plants that probably make them a little stoned. Obviously, there's a story of elephants getting drunk, blah, blah, blah. So the idea of taking in mind-altering substances is totally on the table for human ancestors. But there isn't a 200,000 year ago sudden change like that. There are some, that's wrong. Maybe 250,000 years you can talk about the origins of certain Middle Stone Age technologies, but the brain is the same all the way through, and other things seem to be the same. So I'll have to look at it.
Interesting. That's a tough one. I mean, trying to determine cognitive development, that is such a complex thing, and like you say, there's the cultural effects alone, and the ability to change locally too, because I mean, one group can learn something by, let's say, inventing a new tool, and that group is not connected to other groups, right?
Right.
So I would think a lot of things have been invented repeatedly in different areas.
Again and again, exactly.
Yeah.
Let me address this one question by Titan again. I was in a question: the earliest known humans that could be considered Homo sapiens appeared 300,000 years ago. That I don't think is far from correct. I have seen and held in my hands a skull that had a completely modern cranial capacity, robust musculature. So like Neanderthals have that, and these early Homo sapiens have it. And an ESR date or something, some kind of date on it had come back at 385,000. The problem with the skull, it was found in the attic of a town hall in a small town in South Africa. Somebody had picked it up off the landscape somewhere and passed it on. So the provenience is no good. Okay. This change in stone technology I'm referring to happens at 500,000 years ago. So before this, but this time period in this region, we don't have enough precision. So we have a change in technology of 500,000 years and a skull that's 384. that's fully modern. I'm going to say the modern skulls could be found that go back to 500,000. I would not be surprised at all. I think nobody would be surprised to see that. So there's some stuff in Ethiopia and North Africa that's also roughly the same age, but like 300,000. But I was seeing earlier stuff. So I think when we fill in the blanks, I was just giving a lecture on this today in a high school about this problem. That when I started graduate school, volcanoes in East Africa started becoming really common like 5 million years ago, 6 million years ago. 1.1 million years ago, I think, was like the last volcano. There's maybe one thing that's somewhat later. That was among those volcanoes that were laying down all those layers, with the fossils in between them.
Yeah.
That was 1.1 million years ago, about to way before. After that, nothing. No volcanic dates. None. Then we have carbon-14 dating, which brings us back to 40,000 years. So my advisor, Glenn Isaac, used to call this period from 40,000 years ago to somewhere around 1 million years ago, the muddle in the middle. This is the time period during which our species became a species. Okay. And there were no dating techniques that applied to that time period until the late 80s and 90s. And now we can date lots of things, but still the evidence is still being pieced together and discovered. So we're still in the point in that time period, we're still in that period where you can expect new discoveries to change those dates by 100,000 years or more. Anytime over the next decade, we're going to have new dates all the time. So don't make too close of a model, because it will be wrong. We're still discovering
what range of years was it for the Asian species? Not Peking man. Was it Peking man, or is that the one that was a fraud? I can't.
No, that was the fraud. It was so there's just like in New York as well. There's a whole lot of late Homo erectus, early modern human looking things, and Peking man was a late Homo erectus looking thing. And of course, those skulls are gone. They were hidden away from the Japanese, but they were hid too well and never discovered.
Oh wow!
But there's a lot of Java Homo erectus. There's a lot of Homo erectus stuff in Asia that dates to that period.
Yeah,
and there's a gap, there's sort of a gap after that in physical remains prior to modern humans showing up. In fact, for the longest time until recently, the gap couldn't explain Australia. Like people got from somewhere other than Asia to Australia, because the earliest Australians were earlier. The earliest Australian fossils were earlier than anything in East Asia that existed. I think that's been filled in more recently by a lot of new finds. But that's the kind of idea of how things are piecing together. But we're still very much in the period of discovery for 1 million to 200,000 years ago. That period is still being filled in.
Yeah. So where do you think we're going? Give me a little projection from what you know. I mean, culture is such a strong influence that it seems to override evolutionary pressures, unless you consider culture part of evolution in a sense.
Yeah.
But do we have any sense of where we are headed next? For I don't know, where do you think man would evolve to 1 million years from now?
Okay, I think there's a few things to say about that. First of all, none of these predictions that anyone ever made have come true. However, the early science fiction, I'm reading Saturn Run right now, and that's John Stanford, and he's got the future in 2060, about when they spot aliens landing on a Saturn ring and taking off. So like, we know they're aliens, we don't know what they're doing and why were they in Saturn and do they know about us, kind of thing. But the early depiction in science fiction, like Twilight Zones type science fiction of aliens, who are therefore always aliens by definition, the way we construct science fiction, are always in the future. Like, they're advanced more than advanced. So if they're hominid-like animals or humanoid-like animals, then whatever they are is what we might look like in the future, because we all have the same evolutionary trajectory and in fact can talk to each other usually. So the two ideas there are the really big brain and the really small mouth. Our mouths are small. They are small compared to our ancestors. Our facial musculature is changed. We are losing teeth. The entire evolution of mammals, by and large, is known only through teeth of mammals. We know about a few species. For a few species, we know about other bones, like with humans and certain other species, but mostly we have the teeth because that's what preserves. And the classic evolutionary changes have been the loss of a tooth. Okay. The original mammals had all their teeth, and when you lose some premolars, you lose some molars. And so every evolutionary change forward in time for any lineage has involved the loss of teeth. Cats have the fewest teeth of their ancestors, for example. We are losing teeth now. That's absolutely amazing. There hasn't been a loss of teeth in primate evolution. There's hardly any changes in tooth number in primate evolution. We have a few tooth patterns that have been there for hundreds, for tens of millions of years. So our losing a tooth, our molar, our wisdom teeth, is astonishing and huge. People don't think about it that much, but when people look at our fossils in the future, maybe that's and now many people living in American society, probably European society, have their teeth, additional teeth. I had a student the other day had to take a day off. She was getting 4 teeth removed, not her wisdom teeth. Okay, lots of people have extra, right? Lots of people have teeth removed because of crowding. I think because orthodontists have gone crazy, but our mouths are getting tiny because our food is all baby food. All of our food is baby food.
What did we invent or start cooking?
Well, that's actually my research area. I believe that the evidence of cooking comes from many different sources at the origin of Homo erectus. There's some evidence of controlled fire that dates to almost that far back, 1.5 million. It's controversial. I think it's good, but I admit that it's controversial. I don't think it's conclusive. At that point in time, our teeth get small. Homo erectus teeth are a significant reduction, and the bodies get huge. Homo erectus is a huge animal for a primate. Huge. It's the biggest primate around, except at gorillas. And I mean, there are other bigger primates elsewhere. Okay,
what's the size? I have not heard that.
Almost as big as we are.
Okay,
and we're huge. Okay,
yeah.
So in order to get a little, Australopithecines are little, like they're when you have like on our diagram here that's behind us. That's
like 4 feet tall kind of thing.
That would be a big one. That would be a big one. 4 feet tall would be a big one, and for some species anyway. And so they went from 4 feet to 5.5 feet. They doubled in mass. And their tooth surface areas went down to about 25%. So how do you eat that much food with 25% of your chewing ability to get a doubly sized large animal? Some new food comes along to do that. Well, we've got all these Australopithecines, all these other primates eating all the food in the environment, and nobody else did that. So it's not a new food that no one else had. It's a new way of processing food.
Yeah,
it's cooking. So that immediately increases the amount of energy you have. It takes food that's only barely energetic. It makes it more energetic. Cooked food can do that. It makes many food items that you couldn't eat because they're not edible by a primate, makes them edible. So the total range of food in your environment goes astronomically through the roof. Listen, Australopithecines, when we find them dead, and we can tell the cause of death, died because they were preyed on. Later humans, like early Homo sapiens, when we can tell the cause of death, they died from violence. There's a debate. Was it violence because they got kicked to death by some large cow-like thing they were trying to kill, or were they killing each other? But when we can tell the cause of death, there's something that kills them that's from violence. These in between, these early Homo erectus, when they died, and we can tell them what they died from, there's about 3 or 4 we can do this with. It died of something they ate. They died of hypervitaminosis from eating liver of carnivores or some other food-related disease. And in one case, Narukatomi boy probably died of an impacted molar, okay, which is food-related. That's dietary-related death, okay? So they were expanding into food horizons that actually were dangerous for them because they were novel. And that brings all this selection on that.
Yeah.
So I was at a conference a while back on food, and it was a conference that I had no idea what anybody was talking about. It was on food safety, but I was a keynote speaker because I had done this research I was just talking about, so I wanted to hear about that. Everyone else was talking about the molecular biology of food. I mean, how they were comparing canning versus drying, and they were the people who keep our food safe. those scientists had an international conference in Germany, okay, to talk about food safety. And one scientist had discovered a molecule that occurs when food is cooked. It's a molecule that only exists for a few minutes. Like it turns into something else really fast. And so it's when food is cooked, the carbon molecules reorganize themselves. We know all about that. It makes the food tasty, the Melior effect, and so on. But there's a stage some of the carbon molecules go through, which turns into this special ring that's a little different than anything else. It's highly reactive, and it disappears really fast because it reacts with other things. But she pulled some of this out because we are using that substance in various industrial uses. Okay. So she pulled it out and fed it to rats to see if it was carcinogenic. So she got rats, gave some rats a tiny bit, gave other rats a big amount. 2 or 3 days later, they were all dead. They were all dead. The ones that got the tiny amount were just as dead as the ones that got a large amount of cancer. They're like instant. These are special rats that are designed to get cancer if you look at them hard. Okay.
Yeah.
But these are things in our cooked food that we're eating all the time. Okay. It's very common for rats as lab animals to do really badly when they're fed human food. It causes a lot of scares. Like we fed these rats, Rice Krispies, and they all got cancer. So now we're all going to die because we eat Rice. The truth is that 2 million years of eating cooked food has changed our enzymes, our digestive system.
Yeah.
So we don't die from it. And most rats probably don't either because they're eating cooked food too, because they're eating our garbage, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Makes sense.
So that's just a huge change in our physiology has happened. And it's 2 million years of change through at least 2 or 3 different species. We've been eating at least some of the food's been cooked, probably a lot of it.
Yeah. Well, Greg, this has been interesting. I mean, there's just so much to learn, and we know what we know right now, and we know more than we knew 100 years ago. I just look at the numbers of hominids that have been discovered in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And yet there's so much more. So keep doing what you're doing. For viewers out there that are younger generation looking for a field, boy, this will be a great field. There's just so much more to learn. So I appreciate what you're doing as a communicator too, because it's important, and I hope that it stimulates interest in kids, and especially to ask questions and come up with questions and go try to figure out and find out what we know and what's to learn next, because that's where the research happens.
Yeah, I appreciate those words. And I do would just add that it's probably not the best career choice, but it's a really good thing to know about. It's like the people who paint nice oil paintings in their basement, but they're not really that good.
Yeah.
So we can appreciate human evolution and the study of it and even participate in it. You can go to field school. You can, anthropology is a really good pre-med degree.
Well, honestly, I think you're understating it, because, if you understand evolution, even broadly conceptually, it allows you to dismiss a lot of other things that don't make sense, or that are made up explanations.
Right.
So those become just so stories. Evolution is really what the evidence shows.
Yeah, that's really
vastly from 8 different directions.
Yeah.
So it helps. It helps on that.
It's like philosophy. It's a good field to learn to think about things. Except it's better because you don't have to do philosophy, which is hard. It's really hard.
Yeah. All right, Greg. It's been great, and I'm sure we'll see you again down the road. Let's see, Wes. Did I have a promo to do here? I don't see one, so I'm just going to say thank you then. And Sonny, I hope you feel better. I know we have a new Patreon sponsor, so I wish I had the name, but consider supporting the work we do here at Skeptic Haven. Definitely like and subscribe here. Set that little bell if you want to get a notice of the next episode when it comes out. And thanks again, Greg, and we'll see you probably fairly soon down the road.
Great. Thanks, Phil. I was always having a good time talking to you.
Enjoyed it. Thanks. You too.
Bye.